improvise, adapt, and overcome.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Carry On Podcast, SITREP edition for the week of February 19th. I am Brad Colbert, the Iceman, your host, as we look at global events, current and ongoing, in a unbiased and unvarnished view. I appreciated everyone's patience last week. We had a little bit of a technical error with the first couple of seconds of our video content. Shouldn't have been a problem for those of you that were listening only, and it has been resolved. So let's begin at the beginning, which is a very good place to start. We'll go once around the world, and we'll check in with Iran and their negotiations with the United States. We'll look at what a potential conflict with Iran might look like. We're also going to talk a little bit about Russian assassination through the ages and a very recent event involving possibly the Ukrainians and their assassination attempt on a senior Russian GRU official. So without any further ado, let's take a look at the world, and we'll start at CENTCOM. We talked last week about the USS Gerald Ford moving towards the Middle East, largest aircraft carrier in the U.S. arsenal, and we now, as mentioned previously, have two aircraft carrier groups in that region. Tremendous strike capability as we go into negotiations with Iran. It is a very strong message that we have both a carrot and a stick. What else do we have? Surging fighters, enablers in the same region in the event that we do have a strike with Iran. We're moving tankers, refuelers, and other maritime prepositioning ships. We also have other assets in the region, not just those carrier groups. We have 3 littoral combat ships. There's plenty of guided missile frigates, cruisers, lots of ancillary ships. We also have aviation reach from some of the areas in the world that has allowed us to launch a potential kinetic strike against Iran. Now, most of the Gulf states have already stated you're not launching an attack against Iran from our country, trying to insulate themselves from potential reprisals by either the Iranians themselves or proxy groups. I think it's pretty much a moot point. I think that the United States has all of the power that they need assembled in those 2 aircraft carrier groups, but if they need longer range, you have the Philippines, you have Guam, you have a couple of other places. Diego Garcia might be able to, depending on what they were launching. But yeah, no problem. The U.S. posture is trying to negotiate from a position of strength under the shadow of an imminent strike capacity. The Iranians are doing the same thing in return. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next segment. Unfortunately, what this does, putting so many assets in one postage stamp size of the world, is there's a huge potential for misunderstanding. There's a huge potential for miscalculation. And especially when you're talking about in the Strait of Hormuz or the Gulf, that when both sides are posturing and watching each other with this carrier density, it does mean that there's a high likelihood of a misunderstanding and a mistake. So I know that the U.S. is very professional, very careful. Our military is not going to go beyond the rules of engagement. Can't say the same thing for the Iranians. You may have noticed they shut down the Strait of Hormuz for a couple of hours the other day, ostensibly to conduct IRGC military drills. It was quickly reopened. And that involved boats, drones, helicopters, launched a few missiles, things like that. So the other thing that you need to be aware of when we talk about having 2 aircraft carrier groups, these aircraft strike groups, is the operational strain. These ships are not cheap to run. They are not cheap to maintain. They require constant maintenance. Having spent somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 years of my life on U.S. naval vessels, the maintenance is constant. Someone is always chipping paint, adding paint, working on some part of the ship, flight deck, superstructure, you name it. It's getting work done constantly while it's underway. But that doesn't remove the need to pull these ships into a dedicated port to do dedicated repairs, to refuel, to rearm, to refit. they break, they wear down. So a lot of people are looking at this as a strain. These ships have been deployed beyond their typical rotation, and it is something that is of concern. The U.S. is the only country on the planet that can do this. We are the only country that consistently deploys 24/7, 365, both a amphibious readiness group filled with Marines and an aircraft carrier group with strike capability. And we deploy those global. So let's see. What are we watching for in the next couple of days? Continue to look for public movement of additional tankers and fighters, any ROE changes, and also any overt missile defense redeployments into the Gulf. We're deploying some of those into other areas of the world, but that does not have the same tit for tat as it does in the Middle East. So that's CENTCOM's AO. That is the one to watch. Lots of things taking place there. But of course, it is not the only AO that we talk about. So let's move over to INDOPACOM. The U.S. plans to deploy additional advanced missile systems into the Philippines, things like Typhoon mid-range fires, as well as some Marine anti-ship missiles. They've got a really cool portable. Portable is kind of a squishy term. Small vehicle mounted anti-ship missiles that the Marines have recently acquired. And this is absolutely framed as deterrence in the South China Sea. This is strong signaling towards China that we own that part of the world, and it is not to be disputed. In history, recent history, there's been a lot of disputes between China and the Philippines in some of that economic exclusion zone, and this sort of sends a pretty strong message. Reuters also has been highlighting a joint sail and drill activity with persistent U.S. naval presence in a lot of these same contested waters. The freedom of navigation exercises that the U.S. consistently participates in, as we've talked about before, is the legal requirement to dispute another country's claim of sovereign waters. You drive a boat through it and you say, no, it's not. It's free and clear, and we just sailed through it. Maritime law is a very interesting thing. I have no interest in going down a rabbit hole about it, but check it out sometime. It is fascinating how the world has gotten to a point where we parse out what can and cannot be done, at least in a legal context, down to every contingency you could possibly think of. But this U.S. shift from presence patrols to land-based distributed missiles and lethality, it really creates a problem for China. It creates a problem for their targeting set, and it tightens our alliance, which includes the Philippines' ability to hold maritime terrain. It is really, again, seems to be my dog with a bone topic, but this all is preparatory fires towards an inevitable conflict with China. It's inevitable. Some people forecast 27, others 29. I'm leaning towards the 27 model. Anyways. So this is gives Manila a lot more deterrence, but it also kind of tethers us into a fast-moving incident around these shoals and straits if China decides to bump into a Filipino naval vessel, or there's some kind of kinetic accident that takes place. We're now obligated because we have boots on the ground. Looking over at Europe Command, NATO is launching Arctic Sentry activities involving a lot of the NATO countries. The Arctic is really becoming more and more this standing deterrence theater. Now that a lot of the ocean levels have changed, a lot of these waters that were heretofore iced over are navigable, and that brings strategy with it. So we have a obligation to defend those shipping lanes and to put deterrence out. And that's a lot of what Arctic Sentry is designed to do. Sweden has announced that they are deploying fighters and rangers as part of that security operation around Greenland and Iceland. And then that is also going to be a continuing focus of effort while NATO commands have conversations about more operational responsibility towards Europeans. That is something that the Trump administration has made emphatically clear. And there has been a lot in the news lately about NATO and European Union countries taking responsibility for their own defense. I'm talking about conversations internally. There was, and we should probably talk about this a little more at some point, the war game that took place with a theoretical Russia encroachment into NATO to really probe the line and see what they were going to do. That did not sit well with a lot of the Baltic countries that were involved in that, even though it was a war game over a completely invented scenario. But it is something that the European Union and NATO are looking at strongly, is how can they absorb more of the defense responsibilities for that part of the world if the United States is not going to, and it doesn't look like we are, unless we get Greenland. I don't know. That whole thing is still ongoing. It still blows my mind. I don't fully understand it, but I probably never will. Oh, by the way, beverage of choice is a sparkling water. I know, before you clutch your pearls, not every day can be a booze day. Sometimes you have to have a delicious sparkling water. All right, AFRICOM, no change. We talked about what took place in Africa most recently on our last SITREP. Not going to belabor the point, so let's move to SOUTHCOM. More lethal strikes on these boats. Killing 11 in one day, at least as far as SOUTHCOM is reporting, and Reuters as well. In parallel, we are boarding tankers, interdicting tankers, anything tied to Venezuela enforcement, anything that's involving that blockade. And that includes vessels as far reaching as the Indian Ocean. So we're not only interdicting vessels that are geographically located in the waters around Venezuela, but we're following them wherever they may go. This is militarized sanctions. It could be handled by the Coast Guard, but you know, when you talk about chasing some of these vessels down for hundreds and hundreds of miles, you need a little more bite. Nothing against my brothers and sisters in the Coast Guard, but yeah, this is blending a couple of different things. It blends counterterrorism, counter drugs, counter finance, and regime pressure, all into one bundle. But it does have a strategic hazard. You are normalizing killing as interdiction as opposed to capturing. If you're framing this as narco-terrorism, then you probably want to at some point make an attempt to capture and adjudicate some of the people that you are accusing of conducting narco-terrorism. I mean, it's good publicity, but it's also just good morals. This kill only invites a lot of legal backlash, partner reluctance, but also retaliation. So my concern is, this is our modus operandi. What do you think some of our adversaries are going to do in the same way? Russia has already signaled, not towards the U.S., but towards the European Union, that they're willing to take on some of these same tactics. The visit, board, search and seizure, the checking of documents, the seizing of cargo, seizing of vessels. So this Caesar to escalation playbook that we're currently inventing in real time, some of our adversaries are now seeing it as justification to do the same thing. And it's a little concerning. I don't think that we should be going down this path necessarily. On the other hand, I am not opposed to neutering this shadow fleet, this 600 vessel, some say more, of vessels that are illegally moving oil and other contraband to avoid sanctions and to, illicitly get some revenue. So that's what's taking place in SOUTHCOM. Moving to NORTHCOM, we've got Locust. The AP finally, or no, it was Reuters. Reuters has finally admitted finally released an article that says that the U.S. Army admitted that they used a locust-directed energy weapon near the El Paso International Airport. We spoke about that in last week's SITREP. This is an Army system that is on the 20 kilowatt range. It's no joke, and it's used to silently bring down UAVs. It's great, but it is on loan, as far as I read the story from Reuters, to Customs and Border Protection, and the permission to use it, the authorities are kind of ambiguous. The problem with the domestic military activities is you have this persistent opacity and contested legal authorities when you talk about this. There's a Posse Comitatus Act. You're not supposed to deploy U.S. forces internally, but then you could justify this as an encroachment of U.S. sovereign territory, which does fall directly into the purview of the U.S. military. So there's a couple of different agencies at stake here. The Stripes is reporting that this additional national defense area along the border expands the Department of Defense's authorities, and it gives more operational space for troops, which, yeah, it does. But then the authorities over who owns what at when and at what level of escalation starts to become real muddled. And the FAA, rightfully so, gets real twitchy when you talk about civilian aircraft in close proximity to lethal military hardware. Could be fixed wing, ground, doesn't matter. Yeah. So Lawfare is tracking ongoing domestic military activities. It's highlighting a lot of these legal authorities and the overlap, underlap, the seams, all of this. This border region is becoming a live laboratory in many ways for counter UAS and new authorities. This is useful, but it's also politically radioactive. The fallout, politically radioactive, I love it, is going to be real, and it's going to be big. I don't think we have seen the last of an El Paso incident. I think we're going to see more. And these experimental capabilities, I also don't think that we're done with the investigation and the after action about what actually took place and when. I hope that we do, because we need to tighten this FAA, Department of Defense, Homeland Security, interagency operability, these authorities, this escalation ladder. So my hope is that Congress does do some type of a deep dive into this and an investigation so that, we can just iron out the escalation ladder. I would really hate to see a civilian aircraft inadvertently be brought down by one of these technologies, not through incompetence, but just through sheer fog of war. And fog of war, it just means confusion, right? There's a lot of confusion that happens when you compress high stress events in a very short timeline. So that is pretty much it for global. Global events have not, with the exception of what's taking place in the usual suspects, been too terribly rich. So let's move over to Iran. As you know from public reporting, as you know from myself reporting, Iran is currently in negotiations using Oman as an intermediary. And while all of these negotiations have been taking place, both sides are preparing for a conflict. It's not going to be a ground war. Highly doubt it. It's probably going to be strikes, if anything. And those strikes are probably going to take place over 3 to 4 weeks, because there's going to be an escalation and then a strike and then a counter strike. And okay, let's talk about what Iran is doing first, and then we'll talk about the likelihood of conflict with Iran. I've already explained in broadcasts all the way up until just now about what the U.S. is doing to prepare for a potential kinetic engagement with Iran. So let's talk a little bit about what Iran is doing. They are doing some overt signaling, such as closing the Straits of Hormuz to do military drills. They're doing some ostensibly covert. They're hardening some of their missile sites. They're starting to put a lot of things underground. They're preparing to ride out strikes in many ways. There's also a covert angle in the sense of proxies. You have a lot of Iranian proxies that, although weakened, thanks to Israel's strikes, they're still out there. And I think that you would be naive to assume that Iran is not in negotiations with those conversations with them about targets to strike. And they've also done some pretty overt messaging about their response to an attack. They will attack U.S. bases wherever they lie, wherever they have the range to attack them. So that's what they're stating and telegraphing. If Iran is struck by U.S. forces, no one doubts for an instant there's not going to be a retaliation on U.S. bases in the Middle East. So a lot of those bases have increased their force protection status. They have evacuated non-essential personnel. They have taken greater steps to harden some of their structures and run some drills. Whenever you have the potential for missile strikes, indirect fire, you do fire drills, just like we did in high school. If you really want to date me, as I have said before, we did duck and cover drills for a nuke strike when I was in elementary school, which is absolutely pointless. But yeah. In case you were curious, the drill is hide under the desk and cover your head with your hands. Yeah, and that's going to work. Iran is framing the United States demands, especially this zero enrichment, as an existential crisis for the home consumption. And it's resisting all expansion of talks to their missiles and proxies, which the United States has hit on a lot. And the Iranians have zero appetite for it. Their messaging, paired with a lot of high visibility signaling in the Strait of Hormuz, is designed to remind everyone that Iran can touch global energy flows and it can touch it fast. There's already been a spike in oil prices, and there's been a lot of forecast of energy markets taking quite a hit. And Iran knows this. Anytime they signal a potential strike, a potential attack, it drives energy markets crazy. Energy markets don't like that. Markets in general don't like that. They absolutely want stability. That's what they're telegraphing. We will hit foreign bases. We will fuck up the Strait of Hormuz. We will drive the cost of energy crazy. We will make it so that companies refuse to insure ships to transit. That's what they're saying. Now, what are they actually doing? Okay. They are reliably disrupting maritime. That is happening is ongoing. We talked a little bit about it. They do it because it's fast, it's scalable, and it's politically contagious because insurance rates, oil shipping reroutes, all of that stuff. So in the Straits, what they're doing is they are hailing ships. They're trying to board them. They're seizing them. They are coming over the radio and say, you need to, pull over, essentially. What that means is that they have to leave the international waterway and move into the Iranian-controlled waterway, and now they've got them. And they're doing it under threat of force. They're using small boats, they're using helicopters, and they're trying to get them to be detained. And that it's harassment. As far as I am seeing, no vessel, with the exception of one, if I remember correctly, was actually confiscated. Most of them are just being harassed, but that drives up a lot of insurance costs. It is disruptions and delays. It is a show of force by the Iranians. It's it's easy to do for them. The Maritime Administration has flagged this as ongoing and current, and most countries are advising to at least U.S. flagged carriers to avoid that place if at all possible. If you don't absolutely have to transit through it, don't do it. In addition to that, you've had a lot of aggressive attempts by IRGC drones, IRGC, the Iranian Guard Corps drones and boats, and a lot of those have been directed towards U.S. naval vessels. We've talked about that before. That is a potential flashpoint. It's a losing flashpoint for the Iranians, but they don't care. It forces us into a situation that we don't want to be in. They don't need to fully close the strait to win. All they have to do is just disrupt it for a little bit, or the threat of disruption. They're also actually declaring that striking U.S. bases is not an abstract concept. It is going to be done, and everyone believes it. This creates a scenario where the host nation of our bases ask, do we want to be a launch pad if it makes us a target? The answer is no, and that dilutes the United States freedom of action. Knowing that we can't launch from some of our largest bases, it forces us to confine towards carriers and longer range strike points. So the last thing that Iran is doing is talking to Iraq and Syria militia groups, the Yemen Houthis, and describing, I don't want to say pre-positioning some of these groups, but they are on a strip alert, if you could use that word to describe some of these militias. They've been giving a warning order to attack U.S. targets if negotiations fail and the U.S. decides to use the stick. They don't actually have to pull the trigger directly when you talk about using some of these proxy groups. They have a history of using them before. They are effective in what they are designed to do, which is harass, deter, and terrorize. They are asymmetrical warfare fighters. They're not going to go toe-to-toe with the United States in any capacity, and they don't have to have an effect. So that's what they're actually doing. There's also some minor information ops and psychological warfare, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. The IGRC closing the strait, for example, it's an implied threat. Look what we can do. We can shut down the region. And yeah, anyways, let's see. I think that's probably it. It's a lot of the usual playbook for Iran when negotiations with the United States takes place. They have done this at almost every negotiation table. It is the best way that they have to leverage what limited force they have. And I want to say limited, but that's putting it relative to the United States. They have plenty of force. They have a tremendous amount of medium-range missiles that can do a lot of damage towards U.S. bases in the Middle East. They can do a lot of damage towards the Israelis, and it takes a tremendous amount of resources to negate that. We have the capability, but it's costly, and that oftentimes is enough. When you combine that with potentially closing the Strait of Hormuz, it's going to hurt. And I think that is the overarching intent of what they're doing. They are trying to signal to the United States that, yes, you can attack us, but it comes at a price. It is not going to be cost-free. And yeah, they're absolutely correct. The wild card in this entire thing is Israel. What will Israel do? How will Israel respond? Will they be part of a preemptive? Unilaterally, they could. Are they going to be part of a attack on Iran? They absolutely could. The problem that is currently, and I mentioned this in the Once Around the World, the proximity of U.S. assets in that region it just creates this very fragile incident ladder where any single clash can be framed as the other side's fault, and then things spiral out of control pretty rapidly. Yeah. So the talks that Iran is currently doing, I'm trying to think about this. I want to make sure that I capture as much as I can that may be important. And Oman is acting as an intermediary. A lot of these talks are not held directly between the United States and Iran, but they're indirect talks. So Iran will go to Oman, their mediators, they will present a demand or a solution or an offering. Oman takes it to the United States negotiation team and vice versa. This agreement between all three parties on this is how they're going to negotiate has worked in the past. And it has borne some fruit. Not much. At least the guiding principles between the two have been agreed on, but there's still a lot of major gaps. The U.S. is demanding that Iran stop its enrichment. Iran is resisting and in return offering nuclear only, no missiles and proxies. And Iran is actually floating some interesting ideas. Well, if we don't enrich on site, can we enrich off site? Can we have a third country do the enrichment for us? Can we buy already enriched material? And the U.S. is basically going, not just no, but fuck no. They don't want any enrichment at all. And to be perfectly honest, if you're not using this enriched uranium for anything more than domestic nuclear power production, you don't need it enriched. I think it's something like beyond 4%. And their enrichment program is taking it to, 60, 70, 80, 90, and you don't need it. So it is taking time. I would imagine that this negotiation between Iran and the United States is going to last at least through March, possibly into April, at least for the next 30 days. One of the traps that these negotiations have fallen into is there is timelines that both sides are putting on one another. While these timelines are in place, we have this increased maritime posture. Both sides are doing drills. Both sides are doing public threats. And you get this narrow corridor where symbolic acts substitute for substantive compromise right up until someone fires for real. It's risky. I don't know how this is going to end. My gut feeling is it's not going to end the way that Iran wants it to go. I think that the United States negotiation team is negotiating from a position of strength, but you should also be a little savvy. Allow for a pressure release. Don't force the Iranians into a no-win situation, because at that point, I think they're absolutely going to leverage a lot of the resources that they have. Look, in the next 60, let's do 30. In the next 30 days, more visible Hormuz pressures, harassment's probably going to continue to take place. We're going to talk about more ship buildups in the area, or possibly a rotation at some point, depending on how long this takes. The one thing that the proxies do for Iran that they can't do themselves is they avoid giving the U.S. a casus belli, or justification to go to war. They have deniability. It wasn't us. It was the Houthis. It was ISIS. It was, insert your favorite actor here. And that is always a clear and present danger for the United States when we start entering into these very intense negotiations while we have both sides basically holding a gun. Yeah. Okay. So let's look a little bit about what a conflict with Iran might look like if these negotiations fail, if there is an accident between one side or another that is justification for conflict, how's it going to play out? I would say this is going to be broken down into three scenarios. One would be a limited strike, ground war, and, well, there's a middle ground, this escalation regional ladder. But yeah, war between Iran and the United States, I think it's unlikely. But it also depends on your definition of war. I think the most likely path is limited strikes. You're not going to have an invasion. The United States is not going to go into the country of Iran. I mean, I can't conceptualize what it would take to justify a land war in Iran. I mean, possibly the release of a nuke by Iran if they had one to release. It's about the only thing that I can think of. I think this is a limited to sustained air and sea campaign. Obviously include cyber, obviously include covert action. Like we said before, those 10,000 Starlink satellite systems did not get smuggled into Iran by the Jehovah's Witnesses. No offense to the Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm just saying they go door to door. And that is a joke. There is, however, war that could be triggered by a very few predictable events, nuclear breakout being one of them, mass casualties to U.S. forces, if there is a Strait of Hormuz shipping crisis, or a preemptive strike by Israel. And that is the wild card that I cannot forecast because I have absolutely no prediction when it comes to what Israel is going to do. A lot of the things that the U.S. does, you can look at common sense, you can look at open source publications, you can use your intuition and experience to forecast a high likelihood model. Even with Trump's impulsivity, you can pretty much narrow what the United States is going to do, at least, 60%, 70% reliability. As far as the Israelis are concerned, I have much less confidence in my ability to prognosticate what they might do. 25%. They have a very robust intelligence network, and they have red lines that are very different from our red lines. And if they feel like their sovereignty is at risk, or as they did last year, that Iran is close to getting the bomb, yeah, they're going to hit. But right now, the posture looks like coercive diplomacy backed by real preparation on both sides. Major U.S. force buildup. Iran is hardening their nuclear and missile sites. And these talks, both sides are negotiating down the barrel of the gun. So the most likely scenario, if this negotiation fails and Iran is struck, is limited strike campaigns. What does that look like? That looks like those aircraft carrier groups, along with naval surface vessels and potentially subsurface, firing a boatload of precision-guided munitions. So for your fixed-wing aircraft, your JDAMs, JSOWs, call it what you will. Other naval vessels firing ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. Wow, ballistic, my bad. Firing cruise missiles, all precision-guided. And as mentioned, you're going to have a rich cyber attack as well. Air and maritime, we're talking probably a few weeks of standoff strikes. I do not see this as being a one and done. They're going to target Iranians' nuclear infrastructure, their missile force, their air force, air defenses, and then all of the IRGC command nodes. Absolutely decimate those. I think, and reporting from other sources on the wire like Reuters has said that the U.S. is planning for a potentially weeks-long operation. And they're planning for the expectation of an Iranian retaliation, which tells me that this is going to be a big campaign. You don't put two carrier groups in that part of the world if you are not anticipating using them. I have said this time and again. Carrier groups are no joke. A lot of combat power. But the carriers themselves are also extraordinarily fragile. They do not have defenses against a drone swarm. If Iran was to decide to take out a carrier, it would be a massive blow to the U.S. morale, and it would also be a massive blow to us strategically, especially if it was the Gerald Ford. That is the largest aircraft carrier that has ever been made, and the most powerful warship on the planet. It would take a bit to take it out, but if you launched a combined, 200 to 300 drones, and that same number of unmanned vehicles in the water, it's doable. So that's the most likely scenario, though, I would say, would be a couple of weeks of air and maritime strikes against those aforementioned targets. Medium probability, it's this escalatory ladder into a sustained regional fight. So Iran is most likely going to respond to any engagement with a huge ballistic and cruise missile salvo on U.S. bases, simultaneously weaponizing shipping in the Straits of Hormuz. That'll cause the U.S. to expand our target set to IRGC naval assets, logistics, production of oil, coastal batteries. That is going to destroy oil markets. Absolutely. Drive the world economy into quite a panic. It's going to put a lot of pressure on the United States to de-escalate. It will put pressure on Iran to de-escalate, but they're not going to be receptive the same way to pressures that the United States is. We are not as immune to global influence on some of our actions as we may think and we may act. Ground war, absolutely the lowest possible likelihood. A U.S. invasion, it's strategically irrational unless one of these black swan events that I had said earlier happens, like a huge mass casualty event, plus the collapse of all other containment options. We can do so much against Iran without putting boots on the ground. Punish, suppress, deter at a far lower cost than putting U.S. forces on the ground in Iran. And quite honestly, what would be the end state? One of the things that I enjoyed about Colin Powell's autobiography, if you haven't read it, admittedly a little dated, but the story is still just as poignant. He fought in Vietnam, and one of the things that he hated about the Vietnam campaign was there was no defined objective. There was no goal line. There was no end state. It was just this endless war of attrition. You would almost take that same viewpoint in a ground war in Iran. What would be the objective? What would be the end state? To depose the regime, to unseat the regime, to kill and capture? How do you do that? The regime is not a person. It is a system. It is an institution. I would hope that we would have learned a lot of lessons from Iraq and not repeat those same mistakes in an invasion of Iran. But I'll tell you, Iran takes out a carrier, launches a nuke, or there's some mass casualty event. I mean, the Gerald Ford has close to 5,000 Americans on that boat. That, in a Trump era administration, might be enough, but let's leave that one alone for the moment. There are essentially 4 tripwires that would make war more likely. First and foremost is a nuclear breakout. They don't have to test it. All they have to do is have intelligence that indicates they are within moments from possessing a nuclear weapon, such as expelling the inspectors, rapid enrichment moves, and clandestine diversion. The International Atomic Energy Administration, or agency, has been reporting that broader verification disputes are central here. And let's not take into account or discount Israeli intelligence. Their intel network has penetrations in the country of Iran far beyond what we do. I'm not giving you any inside baseball. This is open source. This is pretty much acknowledged as understood. Iran and Israel have had competing intelligence penetrations for a generation. They are much closer regionally. They speak the dialect. The list goes on. All that to say is Israel has their finger on the pulse in parallel with a lot of our intelligence agencies on what the timeline is for Iran to get a nuke. This triggers war because it causes the decision window to shrink. Once they have the weapon, a lot of our options are gone. Once these facilities that contain these weapons are deeper, once they're more dispersed and protected, the cost of strikes goes up and the likelihood of success goes down. There's a lot of discussion even now about what the effectiveness, what the damage that we did last summer against their infrastructure actually did. You know, it's hard to do a battle damage assessment without being on the ground. You can do a tremendous amount from satellite reconnaissance. Don't get me wrong. You can. But nothing beats putting someone on the ground and assessing the damage that your bombs did. We didn't do that. There's a lot of narrative coming out of the administration that we did a lot of damage. There's a lot of people whose jobs have been to assess battle damage their entire careers who are saying, not so fast. So the likelihood of Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon in the next 30 to 60 days is slim. But they're also doing a lot of things under duress. They're putting a lot more of their infrastructure underground in these missile cities. They're burying and they're hardening. And that's a concern. So I would say that's tripwire number one of, let's call it 4. Large U.S. casualties, that's another one. So mass casualty event against a base, a ship, an embassy, or a high-profile hostage incident could be another one. Huge escalator. That campaign planning is hard to assess. We're pretty much covered for all of those contingencies. This, I would say, admits that the escalation ladder is active just the way that it is. We have everything that we need in place right now to respond to a large U.S. casualty event. Okay, so that's another one. Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, or shipping crises would be another trigger for war. So temporary closures or harassment or the fear of putting mines in the Strait of Hormuz, any of those interdictions, convoy ops, rapid escalation, all of those would and could signal a U.S. strike almost immediately. We have to keep the shipping lanes open. If there's a tanker, cargo ship, God forbid a U.S. naval ship that is suddenly struck in the Strait of Hormuz, or there's credible information that says that they are about to close it, or we discover that they're mining it, that's an immediate no-brainer. And the last one, I would say, is if Israel strikes first. If Israel assesses that Iran's missile or nuclear reconstitution is crossing their self-imposed red lines, then they're going to strike. And Iran's going to retaliate. And they are not going to limit their retaliation towards Israel. They are going to pull the United States in. And there you go. You have a local. Why would we want to go to war? Why do we even have those carrier strike groups parked off the coast? It is to deter Iran. You don't want a nuclear capable Iran. You don't. We have an obligation as the United States to provide security to a lot of those in the region. We have promised them. This is not a verbal promise. We have security guarantees to a lot of those countries in and around Iran. We owe that deterrence. If Iran concludes that it can hit the U.S. forces and end our shipping commerce with a manageable cost, then every proxy under them is going to learn that same lesson. And that is a dangerous world. You don't want that. We also want to protect energy and shipping stability. This is good for everybody. The Hormuz, the Strait of Hormuz is a global tax risk. Markets are going to react far before these missiles fly. Yeah. And then, I hate to say it, but there's also a domestic angle to this. There's a lot of posturing on both sides. Force packages, all of these campaign plannings, those are expensive signals, and they usually indicate a lot more than they're actually going to be used for. Yeah. Yeah. What do I think is going to happen the next, month? I think these talks are going to continue. I think they're going to eke out some concessions, I hope, on both sides. And I hope that we can de-escalate some of this, pull at least one of the carrier groups off and not have it be so intent on striking. But all it takes is one incident in that region. And this thing can change in hours. So everything that I'm discussing and forecasting with you is based off the situation on the ground on the 19th of February with the assets that are in place and the climate that is currently known publicly. One serious incident, a coercive deadline, something goes kinetic, this whole thing changes in a matter of hours. You already have an intense military posture from the United States. You have Iran hardening their assets, and we are conducting diplomacy under threat. This window that we have to strike Iran is also rapidly closing. So I don't know. I don't think it's likely, but we did discuss the tripwires. If it is going to happen, that is how it's going to happen. And those are the reasons why it might happen. Yeah. Just understand a couple of things, and then I think I'm going to leave it at that. This is not a binary decision. It is not a war and no war. It's really a question of how quickly this cycle moves from coercive diplomacy to limited strikes to retaliation management. That's where most wars live now. And a lot of this public reporting that you're hearing, you're not hearing in public reporting what the red lines are for the Iranians. You're really not hearing what the red lines are for us either. You're not privy to some of the covert back channel communications that take place. Yes, you have two pairs of negotiating teams in Oman, very publicly, above board, negotiating. There's also a tremendous amount of back channel negotiations taking place. The United States has covert lines of communication to, let's just say, people in Iran, right? I don't know who they are. IGRC, IRGC, and others, possibly somebody high up in the regime. I don't know, but these have been used before to de-escalate conflict. Yeah. Just understand that any single casualty-heavy incident is going to collapse these talks and this baseline within hours. Well, stay tuned. We'll continue to check back in with this story and see what happens next week. I think this is probably going to last for a while, and I don't think it's going to get resolved in the span of just a couple of weeks. Okay. Let's move over towards assassination. Interesting topic. And yeah, if you were looking at the news in, 6th of February, you would have seen that there was an attempted assassination against a lieutenant general in the GRU, Vladimir Alexeyev. let's just say Vladimir, I call him Vlad. There was an attempted assassination on this senior GRU general by what was later determined to be a group of 3. All 3 have been found, detained, and are probably undergoing some horrible interrogation as we speak. So the guy that was attempted, he was shot. The individual that was the target of this attempted assassination attempt was widely described as the first deputy chief of Russia's GRU. That is their military intelligence. He's also a figure under Western sanctions. The old Soviet KGB is no more. It sort of fractured into a couple of different organizations under the current Russian government. Probably a discussion for another time. What you need to know for today is that he was shot several times in and near his apartment. It was in the stairwell or the ladder of his Moscow apartment. That was back on February 6th. He was taken to the hospital. It was in a medical coma, the last that I was able to read about anyways. Reporting says multiple shots, and then later discovered 3 shots from a suppressed Makarov pistol. Not a bad little pistol, all things considered. It's sort of dated though, but Russian manufactured, very common in Russia. So if you were going to obtain a weapon within the country, not have to bring it in cross-border, that's probably what you would have gone for. The Russian officials, their aligned messaging immediately said Ukraine. They framed it as terrorism. They framed it as sabotage. Ukraine's foreign minister denied it, hinted it's probably Russian infighting, which, yeah, it's a theory. It's bullshit. The individual that pulled the trigger, or at least the suspected individual that pulled the trigger, was later caught in Dubai and then extradited back to Russia, which is freaking incredible on so many levels, because it, one, indicated that there was an exit strategy for the assassins, and 2, their ability to track down the shooter reflects a pretty high level of sophistication on the Russians' part, and willing, Dubai was willing to give him back up. It speaks to the willingness of Dubai to cooperate with Russia, to allow extradition. I don't know what the citizenship is of all 3. I'm fairly confident that the individual that pulled the trigger that they found in Dubai had Ukrainian passport, but I won't swear to that. I'll have to double check that with sourcing. So why does this matter? Why does this guy being potentially killed matter? Because he's not just another general. This is, according to reporting, and if it's accurate, he's at the absolute apex of the GRU. And this is the organization that Russia requires for clandestine operations, targeting, sabotage, and influence work. There's a little more to it than this. This individual was also associated with an organization in GRU, in the military anyways, that's absolutely responsible for assassination. And he would be the guy that you would want to take out if you were a neighboring country that was recently invaded by Russia. It sends a pretty fucking strong message. So if Ukraine or a proxy did it, what it signals is that they can reach into Moscow's protected core. It signals that Ukraine is willing to take out anyone they want. It is not just battlefield commanders. They've done quite a few of these, so this is not surprising if it was in fact Ukraine. Obviously, I have no concrete proof that it was, but I have some opinions, and I'll kind of share those with you towards the end. But let's make our way through the facts before we get to that. If it is internal, it signals this fracture. It signals a turf war, preemptive neutralization possibly inside the security elite. It would be pretty telling if it was internal. Either way, internal or not, Ukraine or not, it does signal that you're not safe in Moscow. A lot of people feel that the war is far away from the capital of Russia. It's not. It can be brought right to your doorstep. And it's not the first killing. It's not the first targeted killing of senior military figures. Since 2024, there's been a few. December 17th, Igor Kurlyov. God, why is it that I am struggling with so simple? Kirilov. Thank you. Igor Kirilov. He was the chief of their NBC, their nuclear, biological, and radiological, their troops. He was killed in Moscow by an explosive device planted in an electric scooter. This was great. I loved reading about this. Dude comes out of his apartment and is blown up by one of those stupid electric scooters you see littering most major cities. You know, the ones that you can rent, that people use and then leave wherever they've gotten turned off. In order to do something like this, though, you have to establish pattern of life. Pattern of life requires an intense period of tradecraft. You have to surveil your target. You have to get timings down. You have to know where he goes every morning, what time he goes every morning, so that they can plant that scooter packed with explosives near it. It demonstrates a penetration of their domestic security and a shift towards accountability. It says, you're not immune. Psychologically, it's great. But based off who they're targeting, if it is whomever they are, it's strategic. April 25th, Yaroslav Moskalik was killed by a car bomb. Great pictures of that, by the way. I saw those a couple weeks back. Again, in preparation for this segment. It was really nicely done. He was the head of the general staff, so the main operations directorate of the general staff. Killed by a car bomb. He was in charge of a lot of command and control, shaped campaigns, not just executing them. He was responsible for a lot of the war plans that went into the invasion of Ukraine, and so he would probably be somebody who the Ukrainians would want to target, and rightfully so. December 22nd, Lieutenant General Fanil Sarverov. I'm about ready to have AI read the names for me. He was killed by a car bomb as well. This time it was in southern Moscow. A little bit different. It was placed under his car. It wasn't in. Russia immediately targeted Ukrainian involvement, and which got it. Ukraine didn't immediately respond, which got it. So this is a campaign. I mean, we've got 3 successful, 1 attempted. This shows that the Ukrainians, if it was them, is messaging that you're not safe. It exposes the state's inability to protect its own senior operators. So why this individual did not have a security detail and why he did not take greater steps to try and change up his pattern of life, make himself a harder target, I don't know. It's beyond me. You got to figure if you're number 2 in the GRU, you're basically the number 2 guy in your military intelligence apparatus, and you didn't take some basic precautions to prevent this kind of thing. It's kind of amateur. This is being reported by a lot of people as an escalation. Bombs are one thing. You do those at range. Point blank with a suppressed Makarov is different. That may indicate that it is opportunism. They saw a window and they immediately took it, or confidence. I think it's a little bit of both. They had an exit strategy. They didn't just remain in Moscow. They were in another country. So they shot someone and were able to get out. And that's a high level of sophistication and probably tells me that it was Ukraine, but We'll get to that here in a minute. The other thing that it does is it implies that Moscow's security is sorely lacking. And I think that is probably part of the messaging. I think it, as I said, strategic, yes, but it sends a message. These type of operations, even if done by an outsider, even if done by a proxy, the work involved to achieve this tells me that there are huge security gaps. There's penetrated surveillance and simple institutional incompetence on behalf of the Russians. Why they're targeting a lot of the people that they're doing is, again, it's twofold. It says that your loyalty has a price. There's no way they can strike at the ones that are actually making the decisions about why this campaign in Ukraine is still ongoing. They're not going to touch Vladimir Putin, but they can absolutely send messages. And it's not just vengeance, it's system disruption. You are dragging now a lot of these key individuals into manpower mudsucks, because now you have to have a security detail. Now it's going to be much more logistically complicated to get them to and from work. Now they're always going to be high anxiety, looking over their shoulder, wondering if this car is going to blow up, if there's a sniper somewhere getting ready to take a shot, or if the person walking towards them as they leave the grocery store is about to shoot them in the face. This risk height leads to risk aversion, and it can also segue into bureaucratic paralysis. I kind of hope that it does. I kind of hope that it is the Ukrainians. But let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that it's not. Let's say that it is internal infighting. Ukraine denies that they did it, and they're saying that it was internal to Russia, that they're framing it as factions within Russia are using the confusion, this fog of war, to settle scores. I don't know how many people that this guy pissed off. I don't know what the internal politics of the GRU are. But right now, the Russian economy is in pretty bad shape. And there's a lot of finger pointing. There's a lot of purging. If it was internal, it implies a lot of distrust in the elites, a lot of false flag games, a lot of retaliations, a lot of purges, if that's the case. And Russia, to be fair, does have a long and sordid history of murdering their own people. I mean, it's kind of baked into their history. And that's not me slinging mud. It's pretty much known. But it does destabilize command cohesion more than any other drone strike could do. Infighting or outfighting. One report that I read specifically ties accusations around the shooting to claims it was meant to sabotage the peace talks. I think that's bullshit. Whether or not it's true, it's politically useful, because now Russia can tell the Ukrainian delegation, we are not going to negotiate while you are hunting our generals. It will result in much harsher internal repression, demands for an increased counterintelligence power as well. Not that Russia, which is a quasi-police state in many cases, needs to increase their counterintelligence powers, but yeah, it may result in that towards the local security. And I think that retaliatory strikes are probably inevitable. Russia has tried on numerous occasions assassination attempts inside Ukraine. They have all failed. And yeah, good on them. So you've got two hypotheses for who pulled the trigger. It's either the Ukrainians or it is internal. And it doesn't have to be the Ukrainians directly. They can do it through a proxy. If it is Ukrainians or proxy, it supports the pattern, or I should say the pattern supports that it's Ukrainians. There's been several other assassinations that have taken place of high-ranking Russian officials. And so it does fit the broader asymmetric warfare logic. It definitely says that Ukraine is expanding the front lines, entering into Moscow's psychological space where it should be, right? It's trying to force the Russian elites to take the war personally. The other hypothesis that it is internal, this implies that Russia is in a phase where the regime is just becoming this self-consuming machine where they start purging and panicking. There's this paranoia. Loyalty is questioned. Something like this, if true, is worse for the Russian stability than any external attack. Okay. I don't think that's the case. And I'm going to explain why here in a minute. But they have somebody in custody. I would imagine that they are interrogating this individual and individuals pretty fucking harshly. I mean, yeah. So either the Ukrainians did it or the terror network did it. That's going to be public. That is going to be what the media is going to put out. Doesn't matter what the reality is. There's going to be a surge for senior leaders, motorcades, housing, route randomization, all that shit. This is going to be used as justification for new attacks, kinetic or covert. And then I would see copycats, because once this mold is broken, I would expect more of these. Okay. So Occam's razor leads me to believe that it was most likely Ukrainian intel. The individual in question, and I have said this already, is responsible for their overseas assassination unit. So he would have been the one responsible for the poisoning in the UK. Definitely high on SBU, the Ukrainian Intelligence Services list. 3 people shows a high level of sophistication. Their escape planning also shows that. I don't see this as being a lone wolf because of this. I think the reasons that the Ukrainians are denying it is because that's what you do. But also they probably have other operations planned and they don't want to tip the Russians off. They don't want to tell them about the tradecraft that they're using. I would say that the who, what, when, where, and why of this attack is probably going to come out pretty quickly, especially since they have people in custody and they are going to interrogate them pretty harshly. The FSB does not fuck around. Unlike their drone attack that came out of the trucks, where they absolutely had to own it, this one, they can just consistently deny it. They can hide other similar operations in the denial. It's just how it's done. So yeah, I absolutely feel that it was the Ukrainians. I think this was planned and coordinated, and quite honestly, good on them, because the world thinks that Ukraine has the right to assassinate generals because of the atrocities happening in Ukraine. So quite honestly, I could give a fuck, but that's my opinion wrapped up at the end of what was hopefully a fact-based segment on the assassination of the number 2 general in GRU, who, last I heard, is still in a coma. I hope he stays there. It got me thinking, though, about assassination in general, specifically about the Russians and how they have historically assassinated people. You could argue that assassination has a long and sordid history in the planet, but the Russians, man, they've kind of made a science of it. There's a huge segment of American society that believes that the Central Intelligence Agency has and is currently assassinating people. There's a lot of really good books out there that has talked about the history of the agency. I will only tell you that for the last 40 plus years, we have had a pretty stringent policy against assassination in the United States, whether it is uniformed military personnel or any of our intelligence services. We don't do it. It's morally repugnant. It's ethically abhorrent. I could continue to pile on a whole bunch of words. It's just not cool. You could probably counter my argument by saying, well, is a drone strike not assassination? Yeah, I guess so. But it's public. It's accepted. It's not denied. We don't do it behind a veil of covert secrecy. There's a presidential finding that goes into it. It is documented, it is on the record, and it is public. It is very transparent. So yes, we do drone strike the shit out of people. I don't feel that that falls under the same umbrella as assassination. Yeah, so that's my monologue. Let's move into the discussion in detail. The Russian government, in all of its manifestations, it's czarist police. So we're talking NKVD, KGB, and Cheka. If you're looking at the old Soviet Union, in modern Russia, it's the FSB and it's the GRU. One is basically foreign, one is basically domestic, but they have very similar capabilities, and they all sort of came out of the old Soviet Union KGB. When it comes to the Russians' use of assassination, it is not just about eliminating the target, it's about a control. It's used when the regime wants one of three outcomes: either to remove a threat, defectors, opposition leaders, political organizers, deter a class of people through fear. It basically says that we can reach you anywhere we want when you assassinate somebody. It maintains plausible deniability. It can make it look like an accident. It can make it look like an illness, and or just crime, petty street crime, which, yeah. And anytime you can do that, you get an outcome. It is also done for signal capability to foreign services. It tells them we can operate on your soil. You're not immune, no matter how geographically remote you may be. Ask the United Kingdom. And it enforces discipline. It makes your elite uncomfortably mortal, as many have unfortunately found out. All of these Russia has historically used to either hide attribution to their own government, or they weaponizes ambiguity. Historically, the key actors, if we look at old Soviet Russia, NKVD, KGB, including the special tasks and poison R&D. My apologies. In the modern era, the internal security and counterintelligence, that's your FSB, your military intelligence and foreign operations, that's your GRU. And then you have some organized crime, you have some proxy militias. So those are your actors. Those are your players that have done government sanctioned assassination and throughout the last modern times since World War II, basically. The Russians have a poison lab. I don't know if we have anything that is equivalent. I know that we do chemical and biological on a very, very limited scale because it is banned under the Geneva Convention. So I would hope that is not. But when you talk about things like the CDC and other private labs to find cures for diseases, they do have some of these things on hand, but this is different. The Russians have a lab. It's known by a couple of different names: Laboratory 1, Laboratory 12, sometimes called Chimera, but it's a poison lab, and it's a state-run lab whose job is to develop hard-to-detect lethal agents, only used for clandestine killing. That's it. And the mechanisms by which to administer them. So far for the Russians, poison has been the go-to SOP. Why? Because it's slow. It's ambiguous. It's very difficult to prove without labs and chain of custody. And we have seen this play out in a couple of high-profile poisoned incidences or assassination attempts by the Russians. Poison can be slow. It creates paranoia because it's not you were shot, but your body can be turned off. Everybody remembers the North Korean who was killed in the airport. His half-brother. It was his half-brother, I think. That's pretty violent, pretty gruesome. The Russians tend to favor more long-term, days, weeks, months of long, slow, painful death. Very hard to treat, very hard to trace. Usually ingested, so food or drink, sometimes topical or contact agents, sometimes injected, like it was with the Novichok, contaminated objects, things like that. And we played around with that as an option for Castro. It was never implemented. I'm going to get some pushback on that one. Moving on. The Chimera Poison Lab reportedly tested and refined toxins to be tasteless and odorless, very hard to detect post-mortem. So let's look at a couple of the incidents. 2006, Ledivenko was poisoned with polonium-210. A United Kingdom public inquiry concluded that the operation was probably approved at the senior Russian state level, required state-controlled material access because polonium-210 is not found on a corner market. You don't just happen upon it. It was probably given to you, and it was probably given to you by the Russian government. 2018, Skripal, Novichok, nerve agent. Again, used in the UK. UK government materials describe GRU involvement, and a CWC banned agent. Novichok, nerve agent. Nasty stuff. No one's supposed to have it. It's banned. There's a chemical weapons ban on it. The United States doesn't have it. We don't use it. There's no mechanism for delivery. It is very traceable in the sense that there's only a couple of countries that would have had it based off of the individual who was the unfortunate recipient of it. It's probably Russia. There's a really good documentary on how the agents that got into the country that did that did it. Yeah. And then Navalny, he was attempted 2020 attempted assassination, 2024 death, and then it just came out that it was dart frog poison. All of the investigations that were done on that points towards FSB, all track it to the 2020 poison attempt, and then the final 2024 death by dart frog poison. All of this implies that the state of Russia is comfortable with poison being used, that it is perfectly willing to conduct elite disciplines, psychological warfare, all of it. They're not just lethal, they're signatures. They communicate that the Russian government has the capability to operate with impunity, and they don't care who knows it. I mean, the polonium sourcing and state control is exactly the point. You don't casually acquire this material. It was most likely the Russians, and all they did is they just deny it. There's been other methods of assassinations that the Russians have used. They've used targeted shootings. They've used bombs. Sometimes they have outsourced the shootings. Shootings are messy, but individual cases sometimes require the logic that we want certainty. When you assassinate somebody with a kinetic weapon, there's no long-term death. There's no slow long death. It's immediate, it's instantaneous. When you want to absolutely have 100% certainty that you're going to turn the other person off, you use a gun, and it does send a certain type of message more than, it's somewhat less terrifying than slow death by poison. And a lot of these can be blamed on proxy groups, on criminal groups, on loyalists. It sort of keeps Russia's fingerprint off of the trigger, but it's done, and it's done regularly. Bombs, they have absolutely assassinated with bombs. It tells a completely different story. It combines high lethality and public fear, could be criminal storylines. You have some deniability there. And then you also have accidents and falls. He slipped in the shower. They fell down the stairs. This is the suicide, accident, or health event. It also has a huge amount of ambiguity. And this is the hardest to prove because maybe it was an accident. Analysis of suspicious deaths, it doesn't necessarily mean that it was an assassination. I think a lot of the tradecraft leads on whatever Russia needs to send, whatever type of message, whatever plausible deniability. So, some methods scream a state, such as toxins or radioactive materials. Others don't scream state, accidents, things like that. Russia decides what they want to do. Sometimes they want to be loud. Sometimes they want to be quiet. It's not always to be secret. Sometimes it's intimidation. The high-profile poisonings were absolutely intimidation. They operate through lots of different layers. Sometimes this is official state services, sometimes regional, sometimes criminal. All of this creates a lot of confusion and fog of war, and it creates hard to track. The Russian government is not monolithic. The Foreign Service Bureau and the GRU versus their proxies, they can decide what evidence they want the public to be a part of and what evidence is very, very hard to prove. I think that a lot of these deaths that are inherently assassinations and were never really proven, are done intentionally. So both sides have done it, the Ukrainians and the Russians. I think the Russians have institutionalized it. I think there's probably very few people on the planet that have made a machinery out of assassinations, and their deniability has been paper thin. Most governments, most people have seen right through it, but at the end of the day, who cares? They did it. It's effective, and it's pretty brazen because the messaging is, yeah, we did it. What are you going to do about it? And there's very little. But recently, the Russians found out that that sword cuts both ways. So, yeah. I don't know what the negotiations are going to be like for the Russians and the Ukrainians moving forward, but I don't hold out much hope. I really hope that the Russians get nothing. I hope that the Ukrainians dig their heels in, don't concede an inch. The fact that they recovered over 200 kilometers in light of the Starlink satellite constellation being turned off for the Russians, I think is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. We'll see what happens, and I'll be here to report it. I hope that you have enjoyed the segment so far. Everything that I unpack, I try to do without bias, without opinion, without favoritism, and just let the facts lie where they may. And in the event that I don't, I make sure that I give you a pretty robust disclaimer. And with that said, that wraps up another edition of the Carry On podcast, SITREP, for the week of February 19th. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to doing this again next week. And until then, as always, stay frosty.
Improvise, adapt, and overcome.